There have been many revolutions that changed history, and France was no exception. Following the lead and success of the American Revolution, which France supported, both the common people and lesser nobility decided to have their own and replace their government, eventually overthrowing their king. But the French Revolution was very different than the American version in certain ways. What started the French Revolution? What were the objectives? How was it different from the American Revolution? What was the end result? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Both the American and French revolutions had their foundation in the rights of man, and the leadership of both revolutions adopted the philosophical outlooks of such social thinkers as René Descartes, Benedict de Spinoza, and John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This enlightenment was spread among the educated classes by the many societies of thought. The belief that man was inherently destined for self-rule and freedom from tyranny was not a new concept, but it was a new ideological weapon implemented to effect radical change. The American Revolution was an actual war fought to break free from an empire, which required foreign assistance, which was received and established a new nation. The First French Revolution of 1787 to 1799, as to differentiate this event from the French Revolutions of 1830 and 1848, was strictly an internal affair with the intent of changing an existing form of government and replacing it with another. Both the French and American revolutions were born of political turmoil, as is true of all revolutions. They are politically motivated movements. Both revolutions dealt with rising taxes upon citizens to pay for endless wars, a clear segregation of society by class and privilege, and the stifling of personal freedoms and censorship, eliminating freedom of speech. King Louis XVI, like other rulers of Europe, sought to raise money by taxing the nobles and clergy, who were previously exempt, to support not only his lavish lifestyle, but also to fill the coffers to pay for past and future wars. And like rulers in most countries, he was perceived as corrupt. To justify this behavior, rulers likewise invoked the arguments of advanced thinkers by adopting the role of enlightened despots, and by invoking the rule of divine right that God appointed kings. Therefore, their subjects were expected to be blindly obedient. Although scholarly debate continues to argue about the exact causes of the revolution, the following reasons are commonly adduced, such as 1. The bourgeoisie resented its exclusion from political power and positions of honor. 2. The peasants were acutely aware of their situation and were less and less willing to support the anachronistic and burdensome feudal system. 3. The philosophes had been read more widely in France than anywhere else. 4. French participation in the American Revolution had driven the government to the brink of bankruptcy. 5. France was the most populous country in Europe, and the crop failures in much of the country in 1788, coming on top of a long period of economic difficulties, compounded existing restlessness. And 6. The French monarchy, no longer seen as divinely ordained, was unable to adapt to the political and societal pressures that were being exerted upon it. When the Comptroller General of Finances, Charles Alexander de Calonne, arranged the Assembly of Notables, including the clergy, high-ranking noblemen, and a few representatives of the bourgeoisie, especially the wealthy merchant class, in February 1787, the first tremors of revolution started. De Calonne wanted to eliminate the budget deficit by increasing taxes on the privileged classes. The Assembly refused to take responsibility for the reforms and suggested the calling of the Estates General, which represented the clergy, the aristocracy, and the Third Estate, or commoners, which had not met since 1614. De Calonne's successors also tried to enforce these fiscal reforms in spite of resistance by the aristocrats, most notably that of the parliaments, which were the most important courts of justice whose powers were curtailed by the Edict of May 1788. King Louis wanted no dissent. During the spring and summer of 1788, due to a bad harvest and public pressure, Louis XVI relinquished some power and reappointed the reform-minded Jacques Necker as the finance minister and promised to convene the Estates General on May 5, 1789. Louis also granted limited freedom of the press, and France was flooded with both open and underground publications addressing the issues of the day, and all of them provided ideas for the reconstruction of government. The elections to the Estates General between January and April 1789 coincided with further disturbances, as the harvest of 1788 had been a bad one. There were practically no exclusions from the voting, and the electors drew up cahiers de doléances which listed their grievances and hopes. They elected 600 deputies for the Third Estate, 300 for the nobility, and 300 for the clergy. The Estates General met at Versailles on May 5, 1789. They were immediately divided over a fundamental issue. Should they vote by head, meaning one man, one vote, giving the advantage to the Third Estate, or by estate, in which case the privileged orders, the two who owned property in the realm, might outvote the third? Due to this divide, on June 17th, the deputies of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, and they threatened to proceed, if necessary, without the other two orders. They were supported by many members of the lesser clergy who outnumbered the aristocratic upper clergy among the church deputies. When the king's men locked the deputies out of their meeting hall on June 20th, they occupied the king's indoor tennis court and swore an oath not to disperse until they had given France a new constitution. This became famously known as the Tennis Court Oath. Once again, Louis gave in and suggested that the nobles and the clergy join the assembly, which was then renamed the National Constituent Assembly on July 9th. But King Louis, seeing that he was losing his grip on power, began gathering troops to dissolve it. These actions, as well as the fear of famine and the king eliminating the Third Estate, led to the Great Fear of July 1789, when the peasants rose to oppose the presence of French soldiers in Paris, who arrived after riots broke out upon Necker's removal, who was seen as a champion of the common man. Trying to defuse the situation, Louis visited Paris, showing his support of the sovereignty of the people by wearing a tricolor cockade. But other troubles arose when the peasants revolted against their lords. The nobility in particular saw the writing on the wall, and the National Constituent Assembly had to avert disaster, and on the night of August 4th, 1789, it decreed the abolition of the feudal regime and of the tithe. They followed up with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen on August 26th, proclaiming liberty, equality, and inviolability of property, and the right to resist oppression. This was the tripwire of the revolution. Louis again refused to accept those terms, and the citizens of Paris rose again and on October 5th marched to Versailles, bringing the royal family back to Paris. The National Constituent Assembly in Paris continued working on the new constitution. But what started the demise of the royal government was the unrestricted free press that allowed uncensored newspapers informing citizens of current events, and political clubs that allowed them to voice their opinions, and none of these supported the king. The National Constituent Assembly completed the abolition of feudalism, suppressed the old orders, established civil equality among men in France, although slavery remained in their colonies, and made more than half the adult male population eligible to vote. Much like Henry VIII of England 2 centuries earlier, the lands of the Roman Catholic Church were nationalized and sold off to pay the public debt. This allowed previously unqualified persons, such as merchants and even farmers, to become landowners, and was a widespread redistribution of property. This threatened the higher nobility whose power was in landholding. These lands were secured through bonds, which were to be retired after the property transferred, but within a year or more, they were being printed in varying denominations as a new form of revolutionary currency, which naturally created hyperinflation. The Assembly then resolved to reorganize the Church, enacting the civil constitution of the clergy, which was rejected by Pope Pius VI and by many of the French clergy. This produced a schism that aggravated the violence of the accompanying controversies. The new government of France was organized into departments, districts, cantons, and communes administered by elected assemblies. The justice system was changed, and judges were to be elected and not appointed by the king. But originally, the National Constituent Assembly hoped to revise royal government where the legislative and executive powers were shared between the king and an assembly. But Louis XVI wasn't having that either. Louis was a weak leader who depended upon his aristocratic advisors who only had their own interests in mind. So, on the night of June 20th and 21st, 1791, King Louis tried to escape France, but he was captured and brought back to Paris. So, King Louis, though, thought that he had the perfect solution. He would start a war with Austria, but he had to have a reason, so he demanded that Austria abandon its treaty with Prussia, which was denied. Louis's logic was that if war came and if France won, he would be a hero and all would be forgiven. But if France lost, he still won because he thought the Habsburg dynasty and the Holy Roman Emperor, his brother-in-law, Austrian Emperor Leopold II, would rescue him and his sister Marie Antoinette, so Louis declared war on April 20th, 1792. In fact, the Queen, Marie Antoinette, had privately invited her brother to invade France as a counter-revolutionary measure. France started out poorly in the war, and from April to September 1792, France was losing in all areas, and then Prussia joined the war in July, and an Austro-Prussian army crossed the frontier and advanced rapidly toward Paris. The revolutionaries saw these events as the king and queen inviting an invasion to interrupt their activities, which was deemed high treason. The peasants, who were the first and largest section of the population to suffer conscriptions, revolted and occupied Tuileries Palace, where Louis XVI was living, and they imprisoned the royal family and higher nobles within the temple. In early September, the locals broke into the prisons and massacred the nobles and clergy held there. Meanwhile, volunteers and even conscripts were pouring into the army as the revolution had awakened French nationalism. The French forces halted the Prussians on September 20th, 1792 at the Battle of Valmy, which was the same day that a new assembly, the National Convention, proclaimed the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of the Republic the following day. The second phase of the war, from September 1792 to April 1793, the French did well and occupied Belgium, the Rhineland, Savoy, and Nice. The National Convention was divided between two groups, the Girondins, who wanted to organize a bourgeois republic in France and spread the revolution throughout Europe, and the Montagnards, or mountain men, along with Maximilien Robespierre, who wanted to give the lower classes a greater share in political and economic power. The Montagnards favored granting the poorer classes more political power, while the Girondins favored a bourgeois republic and wanted to reduce the power of Paris in total. Despite efforts made by the Girondins, Louis XVI was judged by the convention, condemned to death for treason, and executed on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette was guillotined 9 months later. The French Revolution totally altered society and government, unlike the American Revolution. They created a new calendar, but also created deadly political divisions, unlike the Americans, who, while opposed on certain issues, did not kill each other and worked to create their constitution and create a solid government. As France's fortunes again waned with the creation of the alliance between Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain, the Girondin leaders were driven from the National Convention, and the Montagnards, with massive public support, seized power and kept it until July 27, 1794. The Montagnards adopted a radical socialist-styled economic and social policy called the Maximum, introducing the control of prices, taxing the rich, providing national assistance to the poor and disabled, declaring that education should be free and compulsory, and ordered the confiscation and sale of the property of émigrés. Well, as one may expect, the results were massive revolts throughout the country, which was addressed by introducing the Reign of Terror from September 5, 1793 to July 27, 1794, where at least 300,000 people were arrested, with about 17,000 sentenced to death and executed, while more died in prisons or were killed without any formal trial. Part of the massive public revolt was the conscription policy, which raised an army of more than 1 million men, with many being volunteers, which allowed France to regain Belgium after defeating the Austrians at the Battle of Fleurus on June 26, 1794. This event was one of many that saw Robespierre, the incorruptible as he was called, who had sponsored the restrictions, overthrown in the National Convention the next day and executed along with his brother. Afterward, the Maximum was abolished, the social laws were no longer applied, and efforts toward economic equality were abandoned. But the revolution was still not over, as the royalist White Terror erupted, and they tried to seize power in Paris, but they were crushed by a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte on October 5, 1795. A few days later, the National Convention dispersed. The National Convention had approved the new Constitution, which placed executive power in the Directory of 5 members and legislative power in 2 chambers, the Council of Ancients and the Council of the 500, both making up the Corps Legislatif. The National Convention Assembly that governed France from September 20th, 1792 until October 26th, 1795, during what was the most critical period of the French Revolution, was elected to provide a new constitution for the country after the overthrow of the monarchy and established the Republic on September 22nd. The struggles between 2 opposing revolutionary factions, the Montagnards and Girondins, dominated the first phase of the convention from 1792 to May 1793. Discredited by a series of defeats in the war, they promoted against the anti-revolutionary European coalition, and the Girondins were purged from the convention by the popular insurrection from May 31st to June 2nd, 1793. The Montagnards controlled the convention from June 1793 to July 1794, but a revolutionary government with dictatorial powers controlled by the Committee of Public Safety was established. Not surprisingly, the democratic constitution approved by the convention on June 24, 1793 was not put into effect, so its new role was limited to approving suggestions by the committee. The revolutionaries saw the need to reform and take corrective action, and in August 1795, the surviving Girondins were recalled to the convention, and the leading Montagnards, loyal to Robespierre, were purged. The new republic saw rising antagonisms between the Directory and the legislative councils in France, which ended on September 4, 1797, when the Royalists were removed from both the Directory and the councils. On November 9, 1799, Bonaparte abolished the Directory and became the leader of France as its first consul, in effect becoming a dictator. The new convention approved the revised constitution for the regime that replaced it, the bourgeois-dominated Directory of 1795 to 99, so what began as a revolt against tyrannical rule by a king became tyrannical rule by liberal reformists, only to be later replaced by the tyranny of Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul, later Emperor of France. The French Revolution gave birth to the Napoleonic Wars, which would rage across Europe until 1815 and forever alter the maps and politics of the continent and spread into a worldwide global conflict on land and sea. Napoleon's coup d'etat overthrow of the Directory and substituting it with the consulate was a major move. Although Bonaparte proclaimed the end of the revolution, he himself was to spread its ideals in new forms throughout Europe. But once Bonaparte took control and later became emperor in 1804, all the bloodshed, terror, and efforts by the well-meaning revolutionaries fell into the ash bin of history. Only their legacy remained, but they did create a young and growing republic which stands today. The American Revolution was a bloody war fought against an empire to achieve freedom, and once won, even the domestic political opponents worked together to create a most unique nation with an equally unique set of laws, the United States Constitution. On the other hand, the French Revolution was waged against their own citizens and leadership in a fratricidal frenzy of bloody executions and internal turmoil, and in the end achieved few of their original objectives. However, the revolution did establish the concepts of representational democratic government, universal freedoms, and equality, which are now the model of governance in much of the world. It also established the unique concept of equality among all citizens, secured basic property rights, and followed the U.S. model of separation of church and state and representation through elections by the populace and not just a handful of landowners. The Napoleonic Wars spread these ideas throughout Europe while further destabilizing the influence of the Holy Roman Empire, which would eventually collapse in 1806. The French Revolution laid the foundation for the later revolts in 1830 and 1849 across Europe, loosening or ending the monarchical rule that would lead to the creation of modern-day Germany and Italy later in the century. These ideals would take root throughout the various empires as well as sowed the seeds for the Franco-Prussian War and later World War I. But perhaps the longest-lasting legacy of the post-revolution period was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, the first modern legal code to be adopted with a pan-European scope, and has strongly influenced the law of many of the countries formed during and after the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Code influenced developing countries outside Europe, attempting to modernize their countries through legal reforms, such as those in the Middle East, the former French Empire, and in Latin America, where the former Spanish and Portuguese colonies established their own versions of the Civil Code. So the French Revolution did have a long-lasting effect. Positive or negative, we will let you decide. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.